Hello, everybody. Again, welcome back to this session. We have a wonderful session here. And to we have Debbie Millman as our interviewer. Debbie is the president of the design division of Sterling Brands. She's also the president of the American Institute of Graphic Arts, which is the largest professional association for design. And she's also the chair of the Masters in Branding program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, as well as hosting a weekly internet talk show entitled Design Matters with Debbie Millman. And we had Debbie here last year at Cranbrook, and she did an excellent job interviewing designers. And Debbie will be interviewing Jim Miller Melberg, who is a sculptor and designer from Birmingham, Michigan. He attended the University of Michigan College of Architecture and Design and also Wayne State University. Later attended the Cranbrook Academy of Art, becoming an instructor in sculpture and design at the University of Michigan. And he is, many of you saw his work in the exhibition, his very sculptural play forms. I myself remember climbing on turtles as a kid and having my children climb on the various sculptures that you see actually all across the country. So we're delighted to have Debbie interviewing Jim Miller Melberg.
Good to go? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Jim, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to be talking with you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm surprised.
Why are you so surprised?
Well, I sold my business about, some 30 years ago, 1981. That's a long time ago. And I turned just to doing sculpture because although the business was quite successful, fortunately, so I made a little bit of money, I could do what I pleased. And so what is her name who ran this show? When I was contacted to get involved.
Oh, Amy from
Amy,
Michigan Modern, yes.
Amy's
Can I
name.
ask the
But
sound people to
Amy
raise the
contacted
volume,
me,
please, on Jim?
and they had this exhibit at Cranbrook, where I once attended, but I was not involved. Nobody knew who I was. And so someone suggested, well, we should find out who did this playground sculptures. And they found me out. And so I told Amy at first, I said, well, I've been thriving in obscurity. And what I meant by that was that I wasn't thriving in terms of money necessarily, but I was, it seems to me, being an artist or a sculptor, you have to be unself-conscious. In other words, when you have a project, you have to give yourself to it. And in a sense, my wife was a concert pianist, for example, and she had an expression for it. When she was practicing for a concert, she would work, 6 hours for a day. It was not to know the notes. She could read the music instantly and know all the notes, but it was to make music. And her expression was, you work until it's in your fingers. In other words, you're not self-conscious about what you're doing. It's right there. And when you're doing a concert, of course, it has to be in your fingers.
Yes.
So I have the same notion about creating an idea, is that you have to be unself-conscious. And when I said that I thrive in obscurity, in a sense, if you are known or if you have some notoriety of sorts, it's like having someone looking over your shoulder while you're working. And that's what I mean by being unself-conscious about doing something. If there's a project, you give yourself to it. You don't think, is this the right thing to do? Is this the wrong thing to do? You just do it.
Well, just the virtue of being observed changes behavior, even with
It
atoms.
does, yes. And people have said it in different ways. Cezanne once wrote to a friend, he says, he's saying essentially the same thing. He says, when I'm out painting, and he painted outdoors a lot, as you probably all know Cezanne's work. I think he's a genius myself. But he says, when I start thinking, everything goes to hell. In other words,
Then you become
it's back
conscious
to
of
my
your own
wife's idea
consciousness.
that it's in your fingers. You
Yeah.
know, you don't think about it, you do it. It's there finally.
So, Jim, you credit your father with giving you your early sculpting skills.
Well, my father, in terms of sculpture, in terms of art, my mother was strong in that. And I had 3 older brothers, and I started drawing when I was 3 or 4 years old, because my older brothers drew pictures, and my mother encouraged that. And my father was a pattern maker. He started out doing patterns for ornamental ironwork back in the 20s, when in all the federal buildings they had, for example, if you have steam heat, you had ornamental ironwork to cover the radiators, so it looks good. And so in a sense, it was
So they
kind
were
of
sculptors,
sculpture,
yeah.
But he didn't originate the designs. The designs were usually taken from books of classic designs and so forth. But he became a terrific pattern maker, and I don't know if people understand that, but and even today, it's all done by computers now. But in those days, you have prints of, say you want to make an engine block for a car. You cast it in metal.
So you do.
So you have drawings showing the outside of this thing and showing the inside of this thing, and you have to devise a means, this is all in your head, of making forms from which you could make sand molds, from which you could cast metal. So it's a very complicated thing, and you have to visualize these things from a 2-dimensional drawings. And I learned, all my brothers and I all worked in the pattern shop, and so. But I think that's essential for mold making and sculpture and so forth.
So your father was born in Minnesota.
Yes.
He then moved the family to Detroit.
Yes.
To work in a shop that was making patterns.
Yes.
He then had his own company.
Well, he had to have his own company because it was during the depths of the Depression. We moved here. He moved here with a family, 4 boys, in 1933, in the depths of the Depression, Great Depression. And the company he worked for in Minneapolis went out of business. So he got a job here in Detroit, and that went out of business. So eventually he started his own business, but he was a superb pattern maker. I mean, he was a genius. I was beyond whatever I could do. But
So you and your 3 brothers all worked in his shop, and this involved woodworking, casting metals, working with wax.
Yeah.
And I understand that you started working in your dad's workshop when you were 7 years old.
oh yes.
That's awfully young. What were you doing at 7
Oh,
years
well,
old?
I started sweeping the floors. We all went through, it was like an apprenticeship, and we all went to regular schools, of course, but I'm not kidding, I started just cleaning up, but then I worked with wax. I did the finishing work to start with. And then eventually you get to the point where you can make simple patterns. But my father was a genius. He had it all figured out. And he had several people working for him. He was known for training people in pattern work. So.
And did your brothers end up artists as well?
Did my brothers do
Did
it?
your brothers end up artists as well?
No. One became an engineer, one became a farmer, and one became dead in World War II, unfortunately. So. He wanted to be a doctor, actually. I have one brother who worked internationally for Ingersoll Rand, and the pattern work had something to do with what he did, because he would interpret complicated drawings to people who were building big compressors and so forth for Ingersoll Rand. So that helped, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So you attended a number of different universities. The University of Michigan, Wayne State University, Cranbrook.
I didn't fit in.
And you even went to Paris, and you pursued independent study in England and France. Why?
Well, I didn't, it was sort of a self-administered education, actually. Because I had all the skills. For example, I took a sculpture class. I was in architecture for a while at Michigan, and I took a course in sculpture. It was like going to kindergarten for me. I mean, it was, I knew how to do all this stuff, and it was ideas that I was looking for. And where do you get ideas? You don't get them necessarily at a university. If I were studying philosophy, well, then I would study ideas. But in the arts, an idea is an emotional idea. It has nothing to do with, 1, 2, 3, or 4.
So you already had the skills, so being in school felt like...
Well, yeah,
going
I was on
backwards,
my own as a sculptor. Once I decided, well, I dabbled in architecture a little bit. My brother and I built a house that I designed at one time, but we were builders in our families, made stuff.
So did you always know that you wanted to be a sculptor once you...
No,
So
no,
how did...
first I wanted to be a painter.
Right. So drawing has always been a real passion of yours.
It is. Where my mother came in is that she recognized that I had an unusual talent as a boy. And so she bought me a book when I was 14 or 15. I think it was on drawing the figure. I think it was Zadenberg, I think it was the name of the artist. He was famous at the time. But in the back of the book, it was not just the figure drawing that I was interested in, but in the back of the book were illustrations by Michelangelo, Unger, all the great craftsmen of the world. And so I would copy these drawings. And I think that's where you learn by seeing and doing.
So what made you decide to choose sculpture over drawing?
Well, I don't know. I think I met a sculptor, and I was not, well, you have to imagine, I graduated from high school in 1946, just after the war. And I never heard of Cézanne. I didn't even know about Picasso. I didn't know anything about modern sculpture. My idea of painting was Norman Rockwell, who was doing illustrations, and he was a good painter, actually. But I didn't know anything about modern art. I met a sculptor, and he introduced me to all the modernists, and that's when I fell in love with sculpture, seeing what was happening at that time. And my first love was Rodin, of course. And,
Why?
Why? Well, because his stuff, it doesn't sit still. It looks like it's moving outwards in a sense. And I think good sculpture, when I do an animal, for example, sculpture, I do animal sculptures, and I didn't want to do abstract animal sculptures. I wanted kids to think that was a real animal and I can crawl on it. It's for little kids, the animal.
Well, it was very different from your earlier work, which was much more
Oh,
abstract.
yes, it's much different from the other stuff I do. But Rodin is, to me, he brought a real life to sculpture. And the way he put it, in a sense, is that you have to sense that there's a life inside the piece, And Henry Moore does that, and all the really good, profound, traditional sculptors do that. And also the sculpture, I look at sculpture from all ages. You learn from looking and seeing what other cultures do, and the so-called primitives were doing absolutely great sculpture. That was a way of, and I've always thought of the arts as an expression of emotional ideas.
In what way? Can you elaborate?
Let's see, a good way to describe it is I recently did a piece, it's a 4-part series of relief sculptures. I was in the Korean War, and I had a small photograph. The war ended while I was there, fortunately. I had a small photograph of the battleground when it was vacated. And we were just north of Seoul, the capital of Korea, and it was a very, very tough place to do battle. and the hills were all smashed down. There was no vegetation. There were trenches and caves, and you know, it was just a devastated area. And so I saw this photograph, and I evolved a painting I called not a sculpture I called the Battleground, but it was abstracted from this. And another thing, it relates to the Korean War, is I wrote it it's in my website. I wrote
War
a
story?
war story.
I actually want to read about that. I want to read a paragraph that you wrote on your website.
Yeah, and that definitely relates to an emotional idea about a small boy who was, you know, you have to read the story to get the sense of it, but it was the sensation of the devastation of the capital of Seoul and the children begging for money and so forth.
So I do want to share a really remarkable paragraph that Jim wrote about a piece of work that he did called A War Story. You first made what you titled enclosed sculptures in the 1950s. You started by doing relief carved in wood, and then you moved into these enclosed sculptures. After you were discharged from the Army, you served in an infantry division in the Korean War.
Oh, yes. So that was kind of symbolic of
Right.
the idea. That's what I mean by an idea.
So you were sent to Seoul for a day on Army business late in the war and witnessed how the people that lived there made do with whatever scraps of their ruined society that were available, and that was the detritus of war.
Yeah.
So this is a paragraph that you wrote about the experience. Shelters were made of pieces of lumber, discarded Army supplies, tar paper, pieces of canvas, and flattened out cans were made into shingles for roof and wall. I was there to visit an Army Corps headquarters, a very restricted area of great contrast to the desolation of the nearby environs. The person I visited in the headquarters suggested we go out in the neighborhood where there was a restaurant that served very good Korean food. It was cold, a light rain was falling, there were no paved streets or sidewalks, and we walked through the desolation to the restaurant, which was a haven in the surrounding chaos. On leaving the restaurant, we were approached by a very thin Korean boy who was begging outside. He was wearing an old GI field coat that hung to the ground. His head was almost hidden behind the hood. A small hand reached out from the sleeve, and in almost unintelligible English, he said, "Money for family." It's not much of a war story, but the image of that small boy covered in the cloak of a GI field jacket standing in a cold rain in front of a small restaurant in Seoul in 1952 has stuck with me all these years, and that image became the outer shell and the inner form of some of my sculptures. It's an amazing story, Jim. And I want to talk about how you incorporated these images into your abstract forms, because you didn't do sculptures, realistic sculptures of begging people. You did these really...
it became symbolic for
Right.
me. It's the idea of the inner and outer life. In other words, the small boy there had this field coat on, but inside was an inner life that was completely different from the outer life. And so I've used this as a theme over and over again.
And the person that you were with was actually somewhat disparaging of this little boy.
Oh, yes.
He wanted you to just ignore him.
I wrote that he said, well, there are usually girls out here with babies saying, GI baby, GI baby. So, but this is war. It's a terrifying, well, we're going through them right now. It's a terrifying experience. When you're on the ground in a war. And it's terrifying, and it's what people don't understand, we don't unless we've been involved in war, is how the civilian population suffers so greatly. Because as a soldier, you're trained to do certain things, and obviously you're in danger, and people get wounded and killed and so forth. But it happens to the civilian population, and they have no training for this. They have no, and I often wonder. I see it on television. I've been through it. I've we went through villages that were absolutely destroyed, and what happened to the people while it was being destroyed, and so we always think of our soldiers over there fighting, and so it's true. We have to think about it. It's a difficult task fighting any kind of war, but yeah, it became symbolic to me as this idea of the inner and outer being, in a sense.
And so, from what I understand, the sculptures, for example, the Prelude to Spring, which was very much influenced by
Yeah,
this experience, don't necessarily tell the story of that memorable incident, but that experience influenced so much of your work. And I couldn't help but wonder if the work that you've done for children was somewhat influenced or somehow influenced by that experience. So much of your work has been really for children.
Well, it could be. It could be. For example, I did the moon house. You probably it was a
Yes.
big structure with an inner and outer form. The children would crawl in it and climb up the forms inside and go on top of it and crawl under it and so forth. And yeah, it became part of my milieu. But I think one thing that has to be mentioned about design work in general is that you learn from looking and seeing. And I think drawing is a terrific tool. To this day, when I go out in the country and I draw, I was drawing, and I draw it because it enhances your view of things. If you're going to draw something, you really have to look at it.
You really have to
really
see it.
have to look at it and see how it's shaped. And I did teach a little drawing. And one thing I said, one project I taught was that look at a tree limb, draw the top of that tree limb, then draw the bottom of that tree limb. Then you get a sense of the volume, and then so I like teaching, actually, but I didn't like teaching at the university.
Why not?
Oh, it's the system. I grew up.
You're a lot of laughing.
Well, I grew up in a pattern shop, and I learned by working, by making things. And when I designed a course at University of Michigan. I was asked to design the course in three-dimensional design. And there are two things in teaching. The first thing is, if you're teaching, you got to care about your students, every one of them. They sense it. If you don't care about them, well, why should I do anything? That's important. The other important thing is you have to give them problems to solve, and you have to help them solve those problems. For example, one study I designed was, I did various things in that particular design course, but one was, I said, kids, we're going to make big stuff out of flat panels. And I want you to draw an idea of what you might want to make. And I described how we were going to put it together and so forth. But I wanted you to start with a drawing. Think about it and make a drawing. Then we took what you call mat board, mat paper, you frame drawings and stuff with it. And we'll make models this big. And so every student made a model of their drawing. Of course, translating from the drawing to the model, there's all kinds of changes because you start, so there's a correlation. And then we picked, I had two classes, and we picked out the students picked out things because it's going to be a collaborative project. We'd have to do these together. Every student could make a 10-foot high thing. We had no place to put it. So I had them pick out, we showed all the little models, and we picked out several that we would make together. And so we had teams make, and they made these things about 8 feet high, out of Upsom board. You know what Upsom board is? It's about a 1/4-inch thick board, pressed paper board of some sort. And we had the availability of a good shop at the old school in Ann Arbor. So we cut out these shapes and assembled them together, and some of the kids would paint the shapes, and some of them were 8 feet high. And the head of the department came and he looked at it, good gosh, we got to show these. So they put them out in the yard I don't know if any of you know Ann Arbor, but the old architecture building sort of across from the law quad, we had some spaces outside. And so we put my students' work out there for about a week in the spring. So, but I love that idea, that way of teaching. And no, I left teaching because I didn't fit into the system.
How, you said you didn't fit into the system when, you said you didn't fit into the system when you were in school, and then you didn't fit into the system you're saying now as a teacher.
I'm a nonconformist.
Why not? Why didn't you fit in?
Oh, I don't know. Someone once told me, I guess, when I left Michigan, the head of the department was very upset, and he said I was, what did he call me? Somehow I was too much of an individualist, or I was just, I was going too much my own way, and I didn't, fit in well enough. I was, for a while there at Michigan, there were some writers in England called the Angry Young Men. They wrote plays about
Angry young men.
bad situation in England after the war, and so I was noted as the angry young man. I would get up petitions to do certain things for other faculty members to sign.
So you were a troublemaker.
Awful things, a troublemaker, right. But and also I was just, the words were, he says, Jim, you are fiercely independent. So
But
well, it
don't
was
you
a
think
compliment
that that's
in a way.
beneficial for
But
an
I didn't
artist
work.
to
Well,
be
the
fiercely
other thing
independent?
I had was, I hate to bring it up, but in the art school, the educationists were taking over.
Now, what does that mean?
Well, I'll tell you what an educationist is. And I was having, we were having beer with some of the faculty members, and the guy was sitting across from me, and he said to me, we're talking about education in general. He says, you don't have to know how to paint to teach painting. You know,
How is that possible?
How is that possible? You don't have to know about sculpture. And he says, besides, I have no degrees, by the way. He said, besides, the only reason you're here is because I have a master's or a doctorate. And every faculty is judged by how many, you get points by how many master's degrees and doctorate degrees and so forth are in that department. And so I had 0 points because I was nobody. And he would give the department, say, 10 points. I don't know what the equivalent was, but in other words, the department gets money by how many points they have, how many, advanced degrees their faculty has. Isn't that strange?
It's actually alarming.
But in terms of my education as a sculptor and as a painter and so forth, I had a doctorate degree, I think.
Yep, absolutely. Let's talk about your play sculpture.
So that was kind of one of the things that bothered me, is it's just the idea that I guess I remember a friend of mine who became a top historian in this country. He teaches at one of the big schools, and he's retired, maybe dead by now. But he went to the Henry Ford Trade School. And then after the war, he was in the Navy, and after the Navy, he went to university and so forth, and became a prominent historian. But I'll bet going to Henry Ford Trade School had a lot to do with his education.
Oh, without a doubt. and I'm sure it was quite a good education.
So it's just the idea of what is education.
So do you believe that it's better for people to see and observe and experience than actually be taught?
No, you have to do both. You have to have training. Now I don't know whether students are getting the kind of training that you need. Well, when you think of is that my phone? Quiet. It'll stop ringing. I don't know.
Want me to answer it for you?
No, I didn't even know I had a phone. No, it'll stop ringing, folks. It's not important. See, it stopped ringing. I didn't even know I had it in my pocket. I'm sorry about that. But I think we have to think about what really is education. You know, is it, does it do, in certain enterprises, obviously, if you're going to become a doctor, you certainly have to have an
Yeah,
education about the human body and how it works and what the latest thing is and so forth, and sciences, obviously. But in the arts also, I think it's important to have skills. And I don't know if skills are emphasized these days at all. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going on right now.
Do you think that there's an over-reliance on,
Oh, this darn thing is what?
I love how popular you are. Do you think that there's an over-reliance on digital or technological skills?
I just don't know what's going on in universities anymore. I have no idea what's going on, how I don't talk to people at universities, and they don't talk to me, and I think the idea of teaching is a wonderful, wonderful idea, and teaching skills. What can you teach? You can't teach a person to become an artist, but you can give him the skills, and maybe he can become an artist and do things. But you can, there's certain, so, and I look to people who are but older people, and I look at the work that people have done. Even now, I look at things they've done, and I think some things are quite extraordinary. You know, the talent that is going involved. But I think in the arts, it's essential that we express emotional ideas about living.
I think that the idea of expressing emotional ideas through living is probably very well represented in your play sculptures. And what I find so interesting about your play sculptures is the notion that there's both an aesthetic appreciation for living by just looking at them, and then there's also the idea that you are actually engaging with them and playing with them and climbing on and through them. And these play sculptures that you're so well known for really happen quite by accident. Can you talk a little bit about how
my initial idea in designing play sculptures was to help provide an environment for play. In other words, for game playing. Well, I grew up in the country, and we always had a garden. We had a little stream going through our property, and had glacial rocks in the stream, and we'd jump from one to the other. But it was an environment that for play, and the swings and slides. When I started designing, swings and slides were about it, but they were starting to get innovative. And those are important. I mean, kids love to swing, love to slide, but the emphasis is on individual activity. What I was trying to get across was to provide an environment for playing together.
But also you've talked quite a lot about the play being imaginative play.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, you just take the play wall. Okay, it's just a wall with holes in it. Well, a kid looks at it and he thinks, oh, I'll go through this hole and into an imaginary place. I'll climb this thing and I'll look down on my friends, and it becomes a thing for the imagination. Or I'll hide behind it and spook my friend when he comes around the other side of it, and so forth. Just simple things like that. That's what I mean by imaginative.
I grew up in Queens, and my elementary school experience was in public school.
Yes.
And there were some of your play animals in my playground.
Oh, really?
And when I was very young, kindergarten, first grade, I had a favorite turtle. So it was my turtle. I actually thought it was my turtle. And I didn't like when anybody else played on this turtle. I really felt that the turtle was real. I felt like the turtle had a soul. And was that something that you intended to happen? Because people, I mean, these are still popular. We're talking 60 years later.
Well,
They're
if you
still
look,
being manufactured. They're still all over the world, China and Saudi Arabia.
well, it's interesting. I was asked. There was an architect in Pennsylvania, I believe, in Philadelphia, who was doing playgrounds for the Saudi government for their housing projects, and he had used my stuff in the past, so he suggested they use my moon house, that great big thing, and
And they thought your name was Moonhouse, right? They called you Mr. Moonhouse.
I got
You got a letter,
a letter
Mr.
from
Moonhouse.
Japan addressed to Mr. Moonhouse. but so he said the Saudis don't want the turtle. They want to know if you could make a camel. Well, I thought, well, make a camel. I didn't know anything about camels. So I went to the zoo and I studied camels. And you know, camel, we think of it as an awkward animal and so forth. It's a very elegant animal. And it's constructed in a very strange way.
In what? Well, because of the humps, you mean, or?
No, well, the hump is one thing, but also I think it has a separate joint in its back leg. Because they fold their legs up in such a way, and I would draw it. And because I wanted to make a camel that was down so little kids could climb up on it. And kids could get up and sit on its head, for example. And so I was studying these camel heads. Strangest anatomy. How in the world can they bend their legs like that? But also I discovered there's a very elegant animal, and I tried to convey that in the image I made. And by the way, when I designed most of all of the turtle is an exception. It's a long-legged turtle. Turtles don't have long legs. The reason for that is so kids could go
Underneath it. Yeah.
But when I make the animals, the idea was not to make a cartoon of the animal, but to make it seem real, but make it accessible for kids to climb at the same time, because I thought that was important. And two of my favorites are the camel and the small elephant I designed. I was asked to do. In fact, some of the best stuff I did in my business was on request. I was requested to make the basketball standard in
And the basketball
Dade County.
stand is still being manufactured to this
They're
day.
all
You
over
designed
the
it in
place.
1974.
Yeah.
So why did you design a basketball standard? Was it a commission?
Well, because Dade County in Florida had been buying my concrete stuff, and they tried to they wanted a concrete basketball standard because of the salt air. It was attacking, you have to scrape the steel and paint them every year and so forth. So they tried to make a concrete one themselves, and they just couldn't do it. So they asked my salesperson down there, they had purchased my playground stuff and some benches and so forth. And they knew I knew how to handle concrete. And so they asked him if I would come down and talk to them about making a standard, which I did. And on the flight home, I designed it. And it was very complicated. In my website, I show how it's delivered and how it's placed and so forth. And it had to be done very efficiently because they aren't going to pay $5,000 for every standard they put up. So I could put 9 of them, 9 or 12 on one of my trucks. They're nestled on the trucks. And the company I sold, my company, Wausau Tile, about 6 years ago, they made 200 of them, shipped them all over the place.
And they're still making the turtles. I've been actually thinking about getting
They're
one.
still making it.
Except they're 850 pounds.
But, there's a funny story about the turtle. My brother lives in San Francisco, near the Golden Gate Park. And so he sent me a photograph. The Golden Gate Park put one of my camels in one of their lakes. They call them lakes, but they're really ponds, if you know San Francisco and Golden Gate Park. So they put one of my turtles in there, and just the shell and the head is showing above the water. And he sent me a picture, and there are 13 turtles on top. He said, there are 13 turtles on top of the big guy. So the turtles would crawl up on it.
That's awesome.
It appealed to the turtles. The last time I was there, unfortunately, the birds were on it.
Oh, no.
And they were leaving their stuff on my turtle.
So
But it's
after
been there for 15, 20 years. Oh, more than that, 30
well,
years.
it
that
could last
turtle.
forever. It's concrete.
Pardon?
It could last forever, right?
Well, in the water, because concrete thrives in water. Yeah, as long as it's not salt water. But the two secrets of good concrete is that it has to be cured, damp cured, for a period of time. So once it's cured and you put it in water, it'll last virtually forever, unless it's salt water and waves. That'll deteriorate the concrete. But that's one of and what I did in my company is when it was cast, we remove it from the molds and we put a sealer on so that the water is contained in the concrete. I think it takes about 28 days for a regular cure to get really hard. But if you seal it, you can reuse your molds quickly and so forth.
After you sold your business to Wausau Tile, you started drawing again, and you're still working to this day doing sculpture and drawing and painting.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you haven't done yet that you'd still like to do?
I'm starting to paint again. I had some serious physical problems quite recently, and the sculpture is kind of difficult for me. I can do small wax things and so forth, but I'm starting to paint again. I got an iPad, and I use it for drawing, but it's not drawing; it's something else.
What is it?
They develop a system for you to use that looks like you're drawing, but you're not really drawing.
How would you explain it? What do you think you're doing?
You have to fit in what you're doing according to what it'll let you do. Now, recently I've been told that there's a new application that is much more complete, but it's fun. It's fun to work. But so I work with that. But I got it just for sketching, basically. If you have an idea, sketch it down. But I just like old-fashioned drawing, and I would like to get into painting again.
Well, I really enjoyed going through your really deep website. There's so much incredible material, stories, pictures, images. So for the audience, I really encourage you to look at Jim Miller Melberg's website, because it really gives you not only a sense of the breadth and the depth of his wonderful work, but also really puts modern sculpture in a really wonderful historical context.
Well, what I try to do, a friend of mine, I had an interesting life.
I would say so.
To say the least. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, Jim, you should write an autobiography." I said, "Oh, I don't. Writing is so difficult." And so then I thought, I did have a website, but it was kind of simple and straightforward. But after Amy got me involved in this, I thought, well, I should be more complete about what I have done. So I call it my story, in a sense. That's interesting, because I think you'll like it because it shows foundry work, and it shows how the development of a sculpture from the initial
Sketches,
idea
photographs,
to the
yeah.
finished product. And I thought people would be interested
Yeah.
in that sort of thing.
It's also wonderful just to see the way an artist works and thinks. Before I open the interview to audience questions, I want to just thank you for quoting George Braque on your website, because it's one of the best definitions of art that I've read in quite a long time, if maybe ever. And so I wanted to share it with the audience. You write about Braque saying, "Only one thing in art is valid, that which cannot be explained." I thought that was absolutely beautiful. So
Yeah,
thank you for sharing that.
That was Braque.
Yes.
Braque and Picasso, of course, developed the Cubism, but my favorite is Braque, and I like him. I like some of Matisse's work is magical, I think, too. But of course, the basis of all of that was Cézanne, and the two of them. Cézanne said, "When I start to think everything goes to hell,"
Right.
and Braque said, The only thing that's really valid is that which you can't explain. And it is true.
It is true.
I have one very short story.
Wonderful.
When I was in Paris, I got very lucky. A Cubist sculptor took me under his wing in a sense. There was a school called Atelier de la Grande Chaumière, which means a big haystack school. It's right in Montparnasse. But anyhow, the story I wanted to tell is in those days, this was in the early 50s, the Louvre was, you didn't even pay to go into the Louvre. And if you've ever been to Paris, you've been to the Louvre, you know, there's a grand hallway with all these great paintings and so forth. And of course, the Nike of Samothrace, you're going upstairs and here's this great Greek sculpture. It's really moving. But what was most moving for me, one of the times I was there, I was walking through this grand hall and there was a little side room and there was nobody in it. But there was a picture, Mona Lisa. That knocked me over. It was the most beautiful thing, most beautiful painting I've ever seen. You know, people say, oh, the Mona Lisa, the Mona Lisa. Everybody raves about the Mona Lisa. But boy, when you see it, and there was nobody in the room except me. And it wasn't covered with glass.
It wasn't covered with glass at that point?
No glass. And I was looking at this thing, how in the world did he do this? It took him 3 years. I don't know if you know that. But Leonardo worked on that painting for 3 years. And you think, but every brushstroke counted. It's just a magical experience.
What do you think is so beautiful? Why is it so mysterious?
I
What
don't
is it
know.
about this painting that
I
has
don't know.
captivated our attention?
It's a perfect thing. They talk about perfect, you know, a perfect diamond and so forth. There's things that are just, everything works. And when you look at a lot of art, you think, well, that's pretty good, that's pretty good. Then this thing is just absolutely perfect.
So as a sculptor, looking at that piece, what do you feel about the discrepancies in the depth of this painting?
I don't know. This thing just lives. It comes alive. It's like the first time I saw Chartres Cathedral. I had a job. I was working, helping to rebuild a youth hostel in France. And I was hitchhiking to, Chartres wasn't too far away, and I was hitchhiking to see the cathedral, of course. And the countryside was like east of Grand Rapids here, these rolling hills, these low hills. It's farm country. And the guy let me off, and I was walking up this small grade. I got to the top, and there was Chartres Cathedral. You couldn't see the town, but it was like this thing floating out there. And of course, you get close, and it's magical wherever you are, wherever you look at it. And that's what I'm talking about. It's the sort of magic of art that somehow somebody puts it all together. And you strive for that in your own work, but you know, it's ineffable. It's
Well,
difficult.
thank you for doing that with your work, Tim.
If
Do
anybody
you have
has
a
any questions-
moment for just one or two questions? Yeah? Okay, so we have some audience questions, and we have a microphone so that it can be recorded and we can both hear it. So the two questions in the second row.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for being here today. I have one good question. Having been in the city of Detroit during its formidable years and witnessing its rise and fall, how would you communicate the value your work can provide to a city like Detroit and its citizens in its current state?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? I'm hard of hearing.
Since it's written, do you want me to just read it here?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
It's a long question, otherwise I would paraphrase. Okay. Having been in the city of Detroit during its formidable years and witnessing its rise and fall, how would you communicate the value your work can provide to a city like Detroit and its citizens in its current state?
Well, I don't think the answer in Detroit, of course, is a political and economic problem. It's not an artistic problem. But if they're going to make a city out of it, the planning is so important, because Detroit, as many of our cities, grew like topsy. Paris, for example, the reason it's such a remarkable place, it was designed to be a remarkable place. The original Paris was designed, I've forgotten the architect's name, but Haussmann. Haussmann designed Paris. And he designed the whole network of parks and streets and so forth, and it works. And Detroit and Grand Rapids, for example, are built like topsy. But Detroit, one of the problems is that when we moved to Detroit, we lived in a tiny little bungalow right down in Detroit to start with. And it kind of worked in that time period. But we're going into a new period, and it's going to be a political, economic, and also planning, and kind of social planning. What makes a good life in a city? And cities are important, but what makes it possible? Obviously, employment is important, but the arrangement of parks, arrangement of roads, so that they're for whatever system is available. Detroit, when we moved to Detroit, it had a terrific streetcar system, which was abolished for some reason, strange reason, because it was extraordinary. Jumping on the streetcar, I remember those old. They were sent to Mexico City. I think some of them are still working in Mexico City, possibly.
And in Toronto.
So transit is very important. We've got to think of transit not just as what makes money for people, but what makes good life for people. And certainly sculpture and decorative arts help the city, and the more the merrier, actually. And what's good about this country is there's so many alternatives, but we have to make choices. I think we have to, in a sense, what's important in cities and in states, for that example, is cooperative effort. And unfortunately, politically, we're being terribly uncooperative these days. But a society depends on cooperation between, segments of the public and private life and so forth. Because, for example, my business would not have existed if it wasn't for Eisenhower building a road system. But that was a big, gigantic cooperative effort. And it made possible. We see all these big trucks going back and forth. We need maybe a new investment in just plain getting around, toing and froing, as they say. But it's good. And so planning has to plan for what is good for people, what makes their life work, what makes kids' life work, and you have to have open spaces. One of the interesting things about Detroit, and I saw it on television not long ago, is there are big garden projects going on in Detroit. These vacant areas, people are just getting together and building great gardens. And that's a good sign.
That's it? Okay. Unfortunately, we have to stop. I'm so sorry. Jim, it's been a true honor. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Oh, we're all set.
For answering the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, folks. It's been nice.